My wife of 28 years just died. At her funeral, in front of 80 people, my own son ripped the microphone from my hands and yelled, "Shut up and sit down. You don't deserve to speak." I was crying, humiliated, while his father-in-law gave the speech in my place. But what happened next changed everything forever. Before continuing, subscribe to William's Revenge Stories and hit the bell, because we have new stories every day. Leave your like and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. I still remember every detail of that morning. March 19th, 2019. The phone rang at 6:30. I was in the kitchen making breakfast for Rose, just like I had every morning for over a decade. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to my sister, Catherine. I didn't need to hear much to understand. The words hit me like a physical blow. "Arthur, you need to come to the hospital. Rose had a heart attack. The doctors say there's nothing they can do." I dropped the coffee mug. It shattered on the kitchen floor, and the brown liquid spread like a pool of blood. I don't really remember how I got to the hospital. I guess I drove. I guess I ran red lights. The only thing I remember clearly is walking into that room and seeing her there, motionless, connected to machines that were useless now. She was 60 years old. I had just turned 62, 28 years together. 28 years of small routines I never valued enough. The coffee I made every morning. The way she'd touch my back when she walked past me. Her laugh during movies. The trips we planned and always put off for later. Later never came. Matthew, my son, was already at the hospital when I arrived. He was 35 at the time, married to Patricia for almost a decade. His father-in-law, James Sinclair, was with him. I remember seeing them together in the waiting room, talking in low voices. When they saw me, Matthew stood up, but his expression wasn't what I expected from a son who had just lost his mother. There were no tears. There was something colder, something calculating. "The widower is here," James said, in that tone he always used when he saw me. I never liked that man. Too rich, too arrogant, always criticizing my way of life, my decisions, my job as a retired electrician. To him, I was a failure. A man who never had big ambitions, who settled for a quiet life, with my wife and my house in the suburbs of Chicago. Matthew hugged me, but it was an empty hug, with no real feeling. Then he explained the funeral details. The service would be at St. Peter's Church 3 days later. It would be a big service. Many of Rose's friends would attend, co-workers, extended family, about 80 people. "You should prepare something to say," Matthew suggested. "Something meaningful." The priest said we can have someone speak about the deceased. I don't know why, but right then I felt something wasn't right. Something in his tone, in the way James watched us from the sofa. But I was too devastated to pay attention. My wife had just died. The pain filled every space in my chest. I spent the next 3 days writing. I wrote about how I met Rose in college, about how she wanted to be a lawyer, but chose to stay with me when we found out she was pregnant with Matthew. About how she worked in an admin office all those years to support our family while I studied for my electrician courses. I wrote about her sacrifices, her abandoned dreams, her unwavering love. The speech was 3 pages long. I practiced it several times at home. My voice trembled every time I read about the day Rose told me she wanted to retire. She had been working for 38 years. She was tired. She wanted to travel with me. She wanted to visit Italy. She wanted to see Greece. We had plans. So many plans. The night before the funeral, I didn't sleep. I stayed in the living room, reading and rereading my words. I memorized every paragraph, every sentence. I wanted it to be perfect. It was the last chance I would have to honor the woman who was everything to me. March 19th, 2019 was the longest day of my life. I arrived at the church at 10 a.m. My sister Catherine was waiting for me outside, her eyes red. We hugged without speaking. There were no words. Inside the church, white flowers covered every corner. Rose's coffin was at the front. I remember walking toward it, touching the dark wood, wondering how it was possible she was inside there. Matthew arrived shortly after, with Patricia and their 2 children, my grandchildren, who barely understood what was happening. James Sinclair walked in behind them, impeccably dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than I earned in a month. The priest began the ceremony. We sang, we prayed. Then came the time for speeches. The priest announced that people wanted to share words about Rose. First, a friend of hers from the office spoke. then her sister. They both said beautiful things, things that made me cry even more. Finally, the priest looked at me, and now Rose's husband, Arthur Miller, would like to say a few words. I stood up. My legs were trembling. I walked to the pulpit. My papers were in my hands. I took the microphone. I took a deep breath. I was about to begin when it happened. Matthew stood up suddenly. His face was red. He walked directly toward me, toward the pulpit, in front of the entire congregation. Catherine saw him coming and tried to stop him, but it was too late. "No!" Matthew yelled. "You are not going to speak." The silence was instant. 80 pairs of eyes turned toward us. I was frozen. I didn't understand what was happening. "Matthew? What?" "Shut up and sit down," my son ordered, his voice filled with a rage I had never seen in him. "You don't deserve to speak here. You don't deserve to honor my mother." He reached for me. His hands grabbed the microphone. I tried to hold on, but he was stronger, younger. The microphone was ripped from my hands. It fell to the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence of the church. James Sinclair stood up. I saw a smile on his face. "I will speak," he announced, walking to the pulpit, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. I was standing there, stunned, my papers still in my hands. My son pushed me lightly toward my seat. "Sit down, Dad," he said, but there was no love in those words. I sat down. My hands were shaking. Tears streamed down my cheeks, not from grief for Rose's loss. I already felt that pain. These were tears of humiliation, of confusion, of betrayal. James spoke for 15 minutes about Rose. He talked about things he had heard secondhand. He spoke about her as if he had known her his whole life, when in reality he barely saw her at Christmas. He talked about values, about family, about respect. I sat in the front row crying silently, wondering what I had done wrong, wondering what had happened to my son. The ceremony continued. Then came the cemetery. Then came returning home, alone. The first few seconds after James took the microphone were the longest of my life. The sound of his voice filled the church while I remained motionless in my seat, the pages of the speech I had prepared still in my trembling hands. No one dared to look at me directly. I could feel the sideways glances, the hushed whispers, the uncomfortable shifting in the pews. Catherine was sitting next to me. Her hand found mine. She said nothing. There were no words, just pressure, just the confirmation that she too was shocked by what had just happened. I had been alive for 58 years and had never experienced shame so deep, so public, so devastating. While James continued his improvised speech about Rose, I watched Matthew. My son stood to the side of the pulpit, arms crossed, staring straight ahead as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if he hadn't just humiliated his father in front of all our extended family, his work friends, his neighbors, his colleagues from the parish. Patricia, Matthew's wife, kept her eyes fixed on her shoes. Their children, my grandchildren, didn't really understand what was happening. The younger one, who was barely 7, quietly asked his mother why Grandpa was crying. She didn't answer. She just held him tighter. I recognized many people in that church. Martha, my lawyer cousin, was sitting 3 rows back. Our eyes met for a moment. Her expression reflected shock, disbelief. Next to her was Teresa, Rose's younger sister, who had traveled from Boston specifically for the funeral. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and I could see she was squeezing them so hard her knuckles had turned white. Rose's work, friends, women she had shared 38 years of daily work with, coffee breaks, and life confidences, were visibly disturbed. Some murmured among themselves. Others just stared ahead with expressions of absolute discomfort. When James finally finished his speech, the silence that followed was deafening. He stepped down from the pulpit with the composure of someone who had just given a brilliant presentation at a business dinner, not someone who had just witnessed a family fracture. He sat down next to Matthew. I saw my son pat him on the shoulder as if congratulating him on a job well done. The priest continued the ceremony as if nothing had happened. We sang Requiem Aeternam. We recited prayers. But everything felt distant, as if I were experiencing it from outside my body, a spectator at my own tragedy. I carried the papers with me to the cemetery. Even as they lowered Rose's coffin into the earth, I still held them. Some people saw them. Some understood what they meant. Others just didn't know what to do with that information. At the cemetery, as we waited for them to finish covering the grave, Matthew approached me. He was completely calm, as if what happened in the church was perfectly normal, justified, reasonable. "Dad," he began, his voice low but audible, "you couldn't have said anything useful anyway." I couldn't even respond. The words stuck in my throat. All I could do was look at him, my own son, the person I had raised, educated, fed, and protected for 35 years. I looked at him as if he were a stranger. "Your behavior in that church was unacceptable." It was the only thing I managed to say. Matthew smiled. A small, almost condescending smile. "My behavior? Dad, you're the one who should be ashamed. We all know what you did, what you allowed to happen." "What are you talking about?" I asked, genuinely confused. But Matthew had already walked away, heading back to where Patricia and his children were. James called him, and they both headed toward the cars parked at the cemetery entrance. Catherine stayed with me as we shoveled dirt onto the coffin. She insisted on doing it, even when the gravedigger offered to do it for us. She wanted it to be personal. She wanted it to be real. Every shovelful of dirt that fell on the grave felt like it carried a piece of my life, my purpose, my identity. "What did Matthew say?" Catherine asked as we walked back to the car. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "He said something about what I allowed to happen, but it makes no sense." "I don't understand what he meant." Catherine frowned. I could see she was processing information, connecting dots I couldn't see yet. "Arthur, have there been problems between you and Matthew? Something you haven't told me?" I thought about this as I drove home. I thought about the last few months. Matthew had been distant, it was true. His visits were less frequent. His phone calls had become brief, perfunctory. But I had attributed it to his responsibilities with work, with Patricia, with the children. I assumed it was what happened when children grew up and started their own families. "You become less important, less central." "No," I finally answered. "Nothing specific I can remember." But as I said it, I started mentally reviewing recent conversations. I remembered a lunch a few months ago, where Matthew had complained that Rose and I spent too much time together. I remembered him making comments about how I wasn't ambitious like other men my age. I remembered the way James always found a criticism, a derogatory remark about my way of life. But none of that justified what had happened in the church. That night, alone in my house, I reviewed the papers I had written. They were still damp with my tears. I reread every word, every carefully crafted sentence. It described how Rose had supported me when I decided to change careers, how she worked without complaint to support the family while I studied, how she gave up her own dreams of traveling the world, of becoming a labor rights lawyer, of living in Boston near her sister. I had written about sacrifice, about true love, about a shared life that, while not extraordinary by James Sinclair's standards, had been deeply meaningful to us. I put those papers in an envelope. I didn't know why. I guess I was hoping for a chance to use them, a chance that might never come. 3 days later, I received a call from the notary's office. There were papers to sign. Rose's will. I went in person because I didn't trust doing this over the phone. The notary was a kind man, about 60, who handed me the document respectfully. Rose had left everything in our joint names. The house, the 2 properties we owned outside Chicago, her bank accounts, her insurance policies. Everything was divided between us, with the majority passing to Matthew after my death. It was what I expected, what we had planned together years ago. But that afternoon, as I returned home with those papers, I began to wonder if I really knew who my son was. That first night after the funeral, I stayed awake until 4 in the morning. The house was empty in a way I had never experienced before. It wasn't just Rose's absence. It was the absence of hope, of purpose, of a reason to get up in the morning. I sat in the living room, on the sofa where she used to read her novels, where her fingers left marks on the pages that I later unintentionally memorized. There was a book on the coffee table, The House of the Spirits, by Isabel Allende. She had started it 3 weeks ago. She would never finish it. The television was off. The silence was so deep, I could hear the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking of the wall clock that had been in our family for 20 years. These small sounds, which I used to overlook, now resonated like reminders that the world kept spinning, that life continued, that only I was paralyzed in this moment of transition between who I had been and who I would have to become. I thought about reviewing the will again. Papers were scattered on the dining room table, but I didn't have the emotional energy to face them again. Instead, my thoughts returned to Matthew's behavior, to his words at the cemetery, to the way he had gradually changed over the last few years, without me really noticing. I remembered the day he was born. It was June 23rd, 1984. I was 26. Rose was in the hospital for 36 hours before he finally arrived. When the doctor placed him in my arms, I remember thinking he was the most fragile thing I had ever seen. His fingers were so small, his cry so piercing. I was scared to hold him, convinced I might break him with a wrong move. Rose spent 2 weeks at home recovering. I took time off work. I spent those weeks watching her nurse Matthew, how she spoke to him in a low voice, how she cradled him when he couldn't sleep. It was like seeing a completely different person in my wife. A mother, a stronger, more determined, more complete version of the woman I had known. Matthew was a difficult child during his first few years. He cried a lot, had terrible colic, but Rose never complained, never lost her patience. I worked during the day as an apprentice at an electrical company, and she took care of Matthew. She did the shopping, cooked, cleaned. When I came home, she would just smile as if she had had the best day of her life. At 5, Matthew started elementary school. I remember taking him on the first day. He was so nervous he threw up in the car, but once we got into the classroom, he calmed down. It was as if something inside him recognized this was his place. He was a good student, diligent. His teachers constantly praised him. Rose kept all his grades, all his schoolwork in a special box under our bed. In his teens, Matthew became more reserved. He spent time in his room. He didn't want me to accompany him to school events. When he turned 16, he started hanging out with friends. Some of them seemed to have more money than us. I remember Matthew started making comments about our house, about our car, which was already 10 years old, about my job as an electrician, which he considered low class. Rose advised me not to take these things personally. "It's a phase," she'd say. "Teenagers are like that. They want to differentiate themselves. They want to think their parents are inferior. It's normal, but it didn't feel normal. It felt like something between the three of us was changing, breaking, drifting apart in a way I couldn't fix. When Matthew went to college, he chose to study business administration. He wanted to work in finance. He wanted to be rich. He wanted a life that, implicitly, suggested mine wasn't good enough. I said nothing. Rose encouraged him. "Let him chase his dreams," she insisted. He met Patricia in his sophomore year of college. She came from a wealthy family. Her father owned several clothing stores across the country. Matthew changed after that meeting. He became more ambitious. His visits home became more sporadic. When he did come, he spent time talking to Rose about investments, about the stock market, about business opportunities. I didn't understand most of those conversations. I would stay in the living room watching TV or reading while they talked in the kitchen. Rose would tell me later, trying to explain the details. But by then, my mind was already elsewhere. When Matthew and Patricia got married, it was a big wedding, 250 guests in a luxury hotel. I was uncomfortable the whole time, dressed in a suit Rose had insisted I buy. James Sinclair was there, of course, beaming with pride for his daughter. He gave a speech during the reception. He talked about family. He talked about values. He talked about the bright future awaiting the couple. Then, he talked about Matthew, about how he had raised a son who was worthy of his daughter, how Matthew possessed the qualities he looked for in a son-in-law: success, ambition, refinement. He never mentioned Rose. He never mentioned that she had worked 38 years to make it possible for her son to get where he was, that she had given up her own dreams, her own aspirations. Now, sitting on that sofa in the midnight darkness, I wondered if Rose had seen this coming. If at some point she had understood that the son we had raised together was ashamed of us, of our life, of our love. I got up and walked to the bedroom Rose and I had shared for 28 years. Her side of the bed was exactly as she had left it. Her pillows still had the indentation of her head. Her scent still permeated the sheets. I opened her closet. Her clothes hung there, waiting for her to return to wear them. I allowed myself to touch a blue blouse that was my favorite. The way she wore it, the way the color made her eyes look lighter. I buried my face in the fabric and inhaled deeply. That's when I noticed something I had overlooked before. On the top shelf of the closet, hidden behind a stack of sweaters, was a cardboard box. It was secured with brown packing tape. My name was written on it in Rose's handwriting. I carefully took the box down. My heart quickened. Rose wasn't the type of person to hide things. She was transparent, honest, direct. The fact that she had deliberately hidden this box meant something. I tore off the tape. Inside, I found letters. Dozens of them. Some were dated years ago. The first ones were from Matthew. Letters he had written but never sent, I suppose. Letters Rose had kept, hidden, protected. I started to read. The first one was from 2014, 5 years ago. The handwriting was Matthew's, but the words were from a man I didn't recognize. "Mom," it began, "I need you to understand something. I can't let Dad continue to be a part of my life the way he is. The people in my circle, my colleagues, Patricia's parents, they all see our father as a failure, as a man who never aimed high enough. And I, as his son, am being judged by association. It's time for him to understand his place." My hands trembled as I held the letter. There were more, dozens of them, all from Matthew, all with the same theme, all explaining why he needed to distance himself from me, why James Sinclair had advised him to cut sentimental ties with me, to find reasons to resent me, to use my mediocrity as justification for abandonment. But the most disturbing part was discovering that Rose knew all this, that she had received these letters, that she had tried to protect me by saving them, without letting me know what was really happening. I spent the rest of the night reading, processing, understanding that this had all been planned, that Matthew's behavior wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, orchestrated, specifically designed to build resentment, to justify rejection, to create a narrative where I was the villain, and he was the victim of my limitations. When the sun came up, I had made a decision. I needed to investigate more. I needed to understand exactly what Matthew had been doing all these years. Why Rose had kept these letters, and why, at the funeral, he had been so sure he could humiliate me. The box of letters became my obsession for the next 10 days. I couldn't stop rereading them. Each one was like a knife sinking deeper into my chest, revealing layers of betrayal I had been too blind to see. But the letters were only the beginning of what I would discover. On March 29th, I received a call from Henry, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down. Henry was retired like me, a 64-year-old man who had worked as an accountant his whole career. We'd greet each other occasionally on the street. We'd share small talk about the weather, about gas prices, trivial things men our age tend to exchange. "Arthur," he said over the phone, his voice careful, as if choosing each word precisely, "I need to talk to you about something I overheard. It's delicate, but I think you have a right to know." My stomach tightened. "What is it? 2 weeks ago I was at the barber shop. You know, Manny's on the corner. While I was waiting for my turn, I saw your son come in. He was with his father-in-law, that wealthy man. James, I think his name is. Well, they didn't want to be seen, I guess. They went straight to the back where Manny's office is. I was there reading a magazine, and I heard bits of their conversation. They were talking about you, Arthur. I felt my blood run cold. About me? Yes, something about money, about inheritance, and about making sure Rose didn't change her will. That was 2 weeks ago, before she passed. I didn't know if I should tell you, but after what happened at the funeral, I decided you had to know. I hung up after thanking him. My hands were shaking as I headed to the room where I kept the financial documents. For 38 years, Rose had insisted on keeping joint bank accounts. It was something she wanted, a way to maintain financial unity as a symbol of our commitment. I never questioned it. Now, as I pulled out the statements from the last 16 months, I noticed something I should have seen long ago. There were transfers, large transfers, exactly $16,000, withdrawn in blocks of $2,000 each, over 8 months. The money had been transferred to an account I didn't recognize. I dug deeper. I called the bank. After proving my identity and explaining I was the account holder, the bank representative confirmed those transfers had been authorized by Rose. Or at least, someone had used her digital signature to authorize them. But then I remembered something. About a year ago, Rose had updated her online banking password. She asked me to stay nearby while she did it. She said she didn't trust technology much and wanted to make sure she was doing it correctly. Matthew was here that day. He had come by to pick up something he'd forgotten at the house. I remembered he was in the living room while Rose was making the changes. I remembered that after that, Matthew had started asking questions about our investments, about where we kept our money, about life insurance, questions he had never asked before, presented in a way that seemed casual, as if he were just curious. Now I understood. Somehow Matthew had gained access to the account. He had been siphoning money, $16,000, approximately what a man might need to pay off gambling debts or failed investments, or simply to maintain the lifestyle James Sinclair had taught him to desire. I went back to the letters I found in Rose's closet. In one of them, Matthew wrote, "Mom, eventually I will have access to everything you two own. Don't force me to take steps we'll both regret. I just need you to understand that this is inevitable. The money is mine by right. I am your son. I am your future. Dad has already lived his life." My second cousin, Robert, was a civil lawyer. I called him that afternoon. I sent him copies of the bank statements and explained the situation. Robert was direct in his response. "Arthur, what you're describing is theft, fraud, but it will be hard to prove without Rose's cooperation. She was an owner on that account, too. Technically, you both had the right to transfer funds. But she didn't authorize it," I protested. "My son tricked her to get her password." "That's what you'd need to prove," Robert replied. "And now that she has passed, it will be even more complicated. Is there anything else? Something more concrete?" I spent the next 3 weeks examining every financial document I could find. Wills, life insurance policies, property deeds. Gradually, I began to see a broader pattern. 6 months ago, Matthew had suggested Rose get an additional life insurance policy. He said it was a smart investment, that the money could be transferred to his children as an educational gift. Rose did it. A $30,000 policy. The beneficiary was Matthew. 4 months ago, Matthew had urged Rose to consider selling one of our properties outside Chicago. He said prices were rising, it was the perfect time, that she could invest the money in something more profitable. Rose had refused at the time. But during the last week of her life, when she was already sick and weak, she had mentioned that Matthew had brought papers for her to review, papers related to that sale. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place when I found a printed email on Rose's desk. It was from a real estate agency. It confirmed that on March 31st, a week after the funeral, there was an appointment scheduled to visit the property. Matthew had made the appointment without telling me. I felt rage boiling in my veins. It wasn't just anger about the theft, though that was bad enough. It was anger because Rose had known. She had kept the letters, she had allowed the transfers, she had seen all this happen and hadn't told me. Why? Was she protecting Matthew, or was she protecting me from the knowledge of what our son truly was? That night I called Teresa, Rose's sister. I told her everything I had discovered. I asked her if she knew anything about Matthew's behavior. "Yes," she replied after a long silence. "Rose told me a few months ago. She was worried, very worried. But she said she couldn't tell you because she was afraid of how you would react. She was afraid you would confront Matthew, and it would cause a conflict that couldn't be repaired. So she knew, and she just allowed it. She tried to stop him," Teresa explained, her voice full of compassion. "She confronted him, told him to stop, but Matthew just denied everything. He said she was confused, that the transfers were to pay her taxes, that the real estate appointment was just to get an appraisal. She didn't know whether to believe him or not. And with everything going on with her health, with the doctors and treatments, she just didn't have the energy to fight. I hung up feeling more alone than I had ever been. My wife of 28 years had been suffering under the weight of this betrayal, unable to share it with me. How many nights had I held her in bed, completely ignorant that she was keeping this secret? How many conversations had we had where she mentioned nothing because she feared my reaction? Now I understood why she hadn't protested when Matthew ripped the microphone from me at the funeral. Rose was already broken. She no longer had faith that the truth would come out. She just wanted it all to end with dignity. I spent that night reviewing the documents one more time. I took notes. I made lists. For the first time since Rose's death, I felt something that wasn't just pain. I felt determination. I finally felt like I had a purpose again. Rose had kept the letters because she knew that one day I would need them. Because somehow she understood that sooner or later the truth would have to emerge, and when it did, I would have to be ready. On April 1st, I drove to Martha's office in downtown Chicago. Her law firm occupied the third floor of a modern building on Michigan Avenue. I hadn't been here in years. The last time was a decade ago, when Martha helped me with some paperwork related to buying one of our properties. Martha is 56. She's the daughter of my first cousin Isabel, who passed away 10 years ago. She was always a brilliant kid, studied law at the University of Chicago, and specialized in financial fraud and civil law. Her reputation in the legal world is impeccable. When I walked into her office, she was reviewing files at her desk. She stood up immediately when she saw me. Her expression changed from professional to genuinely concerned in a matter of seconds. "Arthur, what happened? You look terrible." It was her first comment as she offered me a chair. I didn't know where to start, so I just handed her the documents. The bank statements, the letters I found in Rose's closet, the emails about the property sale, the information about the additional life insurance. Martha reviewed them in silence for almost 30 minutes, her eyes scanning each page, her expression growing progressively darker. When she finally looked up, her words were precise and direct. "Your son has been stealing from you. Deliberately. With premeditation. That much is clear. What's not clear is whether your wife was an accomplice or a victim of manipulation." I told her what Teresa had revealed. That Rose had known. That she had tried to stop him. That she had kept the letters but hidden them, as if preparing for the moment I would need to know the truth. Martha nodded slowly. "That suggests she was being pressured. It's a common tactic. Emotional fraudsters, especially when their family, use guilt and shame to silence their victims. Rose was probably manipulated into believing she was helping her son, that this was something any compassionate mother would do." "What can I do?" I asked, feeling the weight of helplessness on my shoulders. "Legally, it's complicated," Martha explained, leaning back in her chair. "First, the money that was transferred. $16,000. Formally, it was authorized by Rose, even though it's likely your son obtained her password fraudulently. Second, the life insurance. Rose took it out voluntarily. Matthew is the legitimate beneficiary according to the terms of that policy. Third, the property. Although he planned to sell it, he didn't do it before Rose passed, so technically no crime was committed on that front. So, there's nothing I can do?" "I didn't say that," Martha replied, leaning forward. "I said it's complicated. But there are things we can do. First, we need to investigate how your son got access to Rose's password. If we can prove it was obtained fraudulently, that changes everything. Second, we can review the terms of the life insurance. If there's any clause specifying beneficiaries cannot have committed fraud against the insured, then we could challenge it. Third, we can document Matthew's pattern of behavior. The letters you found are crucial. They prove malicious intent, they prove this wasn't accidental. For the next 2 hours we worked together, reviewing every detail. Martha took notes. She asked specific questions about dates, amounts, names of people who had supposedly been present during conversations. She asked me to describe Matthew's attitude during our recent encounters. His exact words, his body language. "I need you to gather some additional documentation," Martha finally said, writing a list. "First, screenshots of any communication you have with Matthew. Text messages, emails, anything where he talks about money, about inheritance, about your finances. Second, names of witnesses, people who witness suspicious behavior. This Henry, your neighbor, will be important. Third, I need to talk to Teresa. She can confirm certain things Rose told her directly. Do you think I can win a case against my son?" Martha took off her reading glasses and rubbed her eyes. "Arthur, the question isn't if you can win. The question is what you hope to achieve. If you want legal justice, then yes, I think we have a case. We can prove fraud. We can request restitution of the $16,000. We can challenge certain beneficiaries in Rose's will. But if what you want is reconciliation with your son, I advise you to let this rest." "I don't want reconciliation," I replied, surprised by the coldness in my own voice. "I want him to understand that his actions have consequences. I want him to know he can't humiliate me without consequences." Martha smiled slightly. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a lawyer who recognizes her client. "Then we'll get to work. This will take time, but between the documents you have, the letters, the evidence of fraudulent transfers, I think we can build a solid case. That same afternoon I called Teresa. I explained that I needed her to talk to Martha, that I needed her to confirm the details of what Rose had told her about Matthew's behavior. Teresa agreed without hesitation. She had wanted to help from the beginning. She just didn't know how. I also contacted Henry. I asked if he would be willing to testify about what he heard at the barber shop. Absolutely, he replied without hesitation. What happened at the funeral was unacceptable. I've seen enough disrespect in my life. I'm more than willing to help you. In the following days, I began gathering all the documentation Martha had requested. I extracted all of Matthew's text messages from the last 2 years. There were so many. Some were seemingly innocent, simple questions about how I was, how Rose was. But when I read them through the lens of what I now knew, each one seemed loaded with double meaning. Each question seemed to be seeking specific information about our finances. One message in particular caught my eye. It was from 8 months ago. Matthew asked, "Dad, how much money do you guys have saved up, approximately?" Just asking because Patricia wants to know if you'd be interested in investing in a business her father is starting. I had replied simply, "We have what we need, nothing more." Why? Matthew. Just curious. Nothing important. But now I knew it wasn't curiosity. It was reconnaissance. He was assessing how much money was available to steal, how much he could take without me noticing. I saved all these messages in a digital folder. The printed documents were organized chronologically in a binder. I spent hours reading them, memorizing them, looking at them from every possible angle. Each one was a piece of a puzzle that, when put together, formed a picture of a young man willing to deceive, manipulate, and steal from his own mother to get what he wanted. One night, while reviewing Matthew's letters once more, I paused on a specific sentence. It was in a letter from 3 years ago. Eventually, I will be responsible for the family inheritance. And when that time comes, Dad's legacy will be erased. His mediocrity will no longer define our family. Mediocrity, that word resonated. I hadn't thought my life was mediocre. I had worked hard. I had provided for my family. I had loved my wife. But for Matthew, clearly, that wasn't enough. In his mind, I was an embarrassment that needed to be eliminated. Now it was my turn to act. Matthew called me on April 14th, 2 weeks after the funeral. His voice sounded different on the phone, softer, more conciliatory, as if he were playing a role he had practiced. "Dad, I'd like you to come for lunch, just us. Patricia will be in a meeting with her mother all day. I have some things I want to talk to you about. Important matters." I immediately knew something was wrong. Matthew never invited me to lunch alone. Our meetings were always uncomfortable encounters at restaurants, where he constantly checked his watch, anxious to leave. But now he sounded urgent, needy even. "What kind of matters?" I asked. "It's better if we talk in person." Saturday at 1 p.m. at the usual restaurant, we agreed on the place, a small Italian establishment called Trattoria di Marco, 15 minutes from my house. I hung up and notified Martha immediately. She suggested something that was both brilliant and morally questionable. "Record the conversation," she said bluntly. "Use your cell phone. Most laws allow one party in a conversation to record it without the other's consent if it's for reasons of personal security. What Matthew is doing can be considered an emotional and financial threat. This recording will be admissible in certain contexts." I spent Friday practicing. I checked how to activate the voice recorder on my phone. I rehearsed different mental scenarios. What would Matthew say? What would he reveal to me? I slept little that night, anxious about what was about to happen. On Saturday, I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early. I wanted to be there when Matthew arrived. I wanted to see him walk in. I wanted to be in control of the environment from the start. I asked for a table in the corner where I could clearly watch the entrance. Matthew showed up exactly on time. He was wearing an Armani suit that probably cost $1,500. His shoes were polished Italian leather. He looked prosperous, successful, like a man who had gotten where he wanted to be. When he saw me, his expression changed. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. It was as if he took off one mask and put on another. The mask of the concerned son, the son who regretted, who wanted to make peace. "Dad," he greeted, kissing me on both cheeks. His cologne was expensive, sophisticated. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," I replied, placing my phone on the table face down. I had activated the recorder seconds before he arrived. We ordered white wine and food. Matthew chose a pasta primavera. I ordered fish baked in salt. While we waited, Matthew started with small talk. He asked how I was handling life in the house now that I was alone, if I needed help with anything. Questions that sounded genuine, but I knew were calculated. When the food arrived, Matthew finally got to the point. Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the funeral, and I want you to know I'm sorry for how I handled things. It was. It was inappropriate, unexpected, even for me. Inappropriate? I repeated, watching him carefully. You humiliated your father in front of 80 people. I know, he replied quickly, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. But at that moment, James and I were worried that something you said might be misinterpreted. Mom was a complicated woman, you know. She had a lot of work responsibilities, a lot of pressure. We were afraid that if you talked about certain details of her private life, people might judge her. I felt my blood boil, but I kept my composure. I was going to talk about how much I loved her, about our years together, about her sacrifices, nothing more. Yes, well, Matthew continued, picking at his pasta, that's what you assume you were going to say, but we know that sometimes, in emotional moments, people say things they later regret. James was just being cautious. Now I was starting to understand. Matthew wasn't really apologizing. He was justifying, rationalizing, revising the narrative of what had happened. James? I asked. Was it James's idea to stop me? Partially, Matthew admitted, but I agreed. We were a team on that. The word team echoed in my mind. Matthew and James, a team. Against me, against Rose. There's something else I wanted to talk to you about, Matthew continued, putting his fork down. About the finances. Here it came. I felt the predatory instinct surfacing. Matthew was finally showing his true intention. What about the finances? Mom left a significant amount of money, he explained, leaning forward. You know that, of course. You're the executor of her will, along with me. But there are certain matters we need to discuss. Like what? Like, for example, the 2 properties in the suburbs. I think they should be sold. The market is very favorable right now. We could get about $2 million for both. That money could be invested more productively. I have no interest in selling, I replied. Yes, but it's a waste, Matthew insisted, his voice becoming a bit more insistent. Those properties generate very little value. They could be working smarter for us. For us? I questioned. The money from those properties is part of Rose's inheritance. I intend to keep them. Maybe leave them for my grandchildren, when the time is right. Matthew put down his fork with slight frustration. Dad, you're getting older. You can't work forever. Eventually you'll need medical assistance, a nursing home. Those things are expensive. Converting those assets to cash now would be a wiser financial decision. What Matthew was describing was my death, my future incapacity, my dependence, and how my assets could be used now for his benefit under the guise of planning for my old age. I've spoken with a financial advisor, he continued, pulling out his phone to show me a document. Look here. If we convert the properties to cash and invest them in high-yield funds, we can double our capital in 5 years. Our capital? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Well, yes, it's inheritance. Eventually it will be for both of us, for the family. The family? I repeated slowly. The same family that stole $16,000 from their parents' joint account? The color drained from Matthew's face. His fork clattered onto the plate with a metallic sound that seemed to silence the entire restaurant. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know about the transfers, Matthew. I know how you got your mother's password. I know about your plans to sell the properties without my consent, and I know about the letters you wrote. Matthew stood up abruptly. This was a mistake. I should go. We're staying here, I said with a calm I didn't feel. We'll finish our lunch like civilized people, and you are going to listen to me. Matthew sat down slowly. His jaw was tight, his hands were trembling slightly. What you did was fraud, I continued, lowering my voice so only he could hear. Manipulation. Theft. What you did to your mother in her final months was despicable, and what you hope to do to me after her death is just as despicable. Dad, Don't talk, I interrupted. Just listen. I have gathered documentation. I have spoken with witnesses. I have contacted lawyers. I have options now. Legal options. I can sue you. I can recover the money. I can make sure the financial industry knows exactly what kind of person you are. Matthew had gone completely pale. Are you going to do it? I don't know yet, I admitted. That depends on you. It depends on whether you learn anything from this. It depends on whether you ever understand what you did. We finished lunch in silence. Matthew barely ate. When the check came, I paid it. I left a generous tip. And then I left knowing I had recorded every word of his incomplete confession. After the lunch at Trattoria de Marco, 3 days passed in absolute silence. Not a call from Matthew, not a message. Nothing. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. I felt it in my bones. I knew he was planning something. That he was consulting with James. That they were reorganizing their strategy now that their plans had been exposed. On April 18th, I received a call from my lawyer. It was Martha. Her voice sounded different, tenser, as if she had been waiting for the moment to contact me. Arthur, I just received a communication from a law firm. They represent Matthew. It says your son is considering challenging certain aspects of Rose's will. Specifically, he's arguing that you, as the widower, exerted undue influence over Rose in her final days. That you pressured her to modify her testamentary provisions in your favor. I felt the floor move beneath my feet. Is that possible? Legally speaking, yes. It's a common defensive tactic. If Matthew can prove there was undue influence, he can invalidate parts of the will. But here's the interesting part. The firm representing him is Sinclair and Associates. It's James Sinclair's law firm, so we know exactly who is funding this defense. What does that mean for me? It means we're going to have to be more aggressive, Martha replied. We need to file our own case before they file theirs. We need to be the ones who dictate the narrative. Do you have the recording of the lunch? I have it. Perfect. Bring the phone to my office tomorrow. I need to make sure it's admissible. I also need you to bring all the original documents. The letters, the bank statements, the emails, everything. We are going to prepare a lawsuit. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the living room thinking about everything that had happened. Thinking about Rose. Wondering if she would have known it would come to this. If any part of her had hoped I would take these actions after her death. If somehow, by saving those letters, she had been asking me for help from the grave. On April 19th, a rainy morning, I entered Martha's office with my documents. She listened to the recording at her desk, wearing headphones. As she listened, she took notes. Her expression hardened progressively. When she finished, she took off the headphones. "This is pure gold," she said simply. His own admission, his acknowledgement that he knew he'd done something inappropriate. Even if the recording isn't admissible in certain contexts, the very fact that it exists shows you have documentation of his behavior. We are going to win. How long will this take? It depends on how aggressive Matthew gets, but I'd estimate between 6 months and a year. Fraud and disputed will cases tend to be long and complicated. 6 months, a year. The time seemed like so much and so little at the same time. In the meantime, what would Matthew do? How would he react now that he knew I was moving against him legally? The answer came on April 23rd, a Thursday afternoon. Matthew called me. His voice wasn't conciliatory this time. It was hard, sharp, like a blade cutting through fabric. "I've spoken with my lawyers, Dad, and they want you to know that if you continue to pursue this, we will make certain details public. About Mom, about her mental health, about the medications she was taking, about how she said confusing things during her last months. We're going to argue that she wasn't in her right mind when she made some of her financial arrangements with you." The threat was clear. Matthew was using Rose's memory as a weapon. He was threatening to tarnish her reputation if I didn't back down. "Do you understand what I'm saying, Dad?" Matthew continued, venom dripping from every word. "You have 2 options. Either you drop your lawsuit and all this goes away, or we publicly expose Mom as a woman who was suffering from early onset dementia. Do you think that's what she would have wanted?" I hung up without answering. My hands trembled as I dialed Martha's number. "It's a desperate move," she explained when I told her what Matthew had said. "It's an admission of guilt. He's using emotional blackmail." "That's illegal, Arthur. I can add that to our case. That actually strengthens our position significantly. He's threatening to destroy Rose's memory." "I know, and it's despicable. But it also shows how far he's willing to go. It shows he has no morals, that he's desperate. When a man like that behaves this way, It means he knows he's losing. 2 days later, I received another message, this time from Patricia, Matthew's wife. Her message was different. It was written in a softer, almost motherly tone. Arthur, I don't know if Matthew told you, but things are very tense between us. He's not sleeping, barely eating. He's obsessed with this situation with you. James is telling him things that are making him paranoid. Please, consider that the children are suffering because of this. Is there no way to resolve this without it going to court? I replied politely. Patricia, I understand you're concerned, but this is between your husband and me. I didn't want it to come to this. But your husband did certain things that have consequences. An hour later, Matthew called me again. This time his voice had a different tone. It wasn't threatening. It was almost pleading, as if he were about to break. Dad, I talked to Patricia. She's right. I've been in a kind of trance. James has been putting ideas in my head. Things I shouldn't have done. Money I shouldn't have taken. Dad, I'm asking you to listen to me. Part of me wanted to believe he was repenting, that he had finally understood the magnitude of his actions. But too much time had passed. I had read too many letters. I had seen too much evidence of premeditation. This wasn't sincere regret. It was another tactic, another attempt at manipulation. I've worked with my lawyer, I told him calmly. We have documented everything. Your fraud, your threats, your attempts at manipulation. The case is moving forward, Matthew. So you won't let this end, will you? He asked, his voice breaking. No, I replied. This will end when you learn that actions have consequences. When you understand that people cannot be betrayed without repercussions. And when you finally value the sacrifice your mother made for you. I hung up before he could answer. That night, I received an email from Martha with a document attached. It was the first draft of our lawsuit, 84 pages, detailing every incident, every fraudulent transfer, every recorded threat, every lie. It was comprehensive. It was devastating. It was the culmination of 3 weeks of rigorous investigation. I read every page slowly, and as I did, I experienced an emotion I had been avoiding for weeks. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't revenge. It was resignation. It was the acceptance that my relationship with my son was over, that we would never get back what we once had, that the damage was too deep to be repaired. But it was also clarity. I finally knew who Matthew really was, and I was finally in a position to do something about it. During the first week of May, I started noticing strange movements in my bank accounts. Small transfers, deposits I hadn't authorized. At first, I thought it was a bank error. I called to investigate. What they discovered was unsettling. Someone had tried to access my accounts. Multiple failed attempts. Incorrect passwords entered over and over. The attempts stopped after the system locked the account for security. But the intention was clear. Matthew was trying to do exactly what he had done with Rose. Seek access. Seek money. Seek control. I showed the records to Martha. She added this to the lawsuit as evidence of ongoing harassment and patterns of criminal behavior. This shows it wasn't an isolated incident, she explained. This shows systematic conduct, a pattern. But what happened 3 days later was even more disturbing. I received a call from the real estate agency that had scheduled the appointment to visit our property. The agent identified himself as Richard, a man in his 52nd who had been selling properties in the area for 20 years. Mr. Miller, he began, his tone carefully professional. I have an awkward situation to report. A week ago, a client came to my office requesting information about a specific property. He said he was the owner, that he wanted to sell it. He showed me documentation that looked authentic, but when I checked our files, the documents he showed had inconsistencies. What kind of inconsistencies? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Well, the registered owner in our files is you. But the man who came to my office, a Matthew Miller, claimed to be the owner. He said he had inherited the property recently. When I asked him to show me the will, he produced a document that had the correct notary letterhead, but the signature looked forged. I have 30 years of experience, Mr. Miller. I know a fake document when I see one. My heart started to race. What did you do? I canceled the appointment. I told him I would need to speak with you directly before proceeding with any sale. He got angry. Very angry, started yelling. He said you two were in a dispute over the property and that he was the rightful beneficiary. Then he left. But I thought I should inform you because, well, this is clearly a fraudulent situation. I appreciate it enormously, I replied. Can I come see those documents? I visited Richard's office that afternoon. He showed me exactly what Matthew had presented. The fake will, the altered property documents, all designed to make it look as if Matthew were the rightful owner of the property and had the right to sell it. The sophistication of the fraud was astonishing. It wasn't the work of someone improvising. It was the work of someone with access to resources, to lawyers, to professional forgers. James Sinclair. It had to be. I asked Richard to give me copies of everything. The fake documents, the date and time records of the transaction, everything. He agreed without hesitation. This is document fraud, he said. You should report it to the police. I will, I confirmed. But first, I need these documents to be part of a civil case we are already preparing. That night I called Martha. I sent her photos of the forged documents. Her response was immediate. This is huge, Arthur. This is aggravated document fraud. This isn't just a civil case. This is criminal. We need to report this to the police. This proves that Matthew, with the assistance of James Sinclair, was trying to sell a property that didn't belong to him using forged documents. This is serious. What does it mean for us? It means we have more than enough ammunition. It means I can add criminal charges to our lawsuit. It means Matthew is facing not only a loss in a civil case, but also potential criminal consequences. A week later, Martha filed the formal lawsuit. 84 pages of meticulously documented accusations. Financial fraud, document forgery, theft, harassment, emotional blackmail, unauthorized access attempts to banking systems. It was all there, in black and white, indisputable. Matthew was served on May 29th. The lawsuit was delivered personally to his business address. According to Martha, his reaction was explosive. He contacted James Sinclair immediately. The two began making calls, contacting other lawyers, rearranging their defensive strategy. But it was too late. The cat was already out of the bag. Over the next few days, I received multiple communications from Matthew. First were veiled threats. Then came negotiation attempts. Finally, there were pleas. Messages coming through his lawyer offering to settle the dispute out of court, offering restitution of the money, offering practically anything to make the case disappear. But Martha advised me not to accept any settlement. Not yet, she insisted. Wait until he feels the pressure of the legal system. Wait until he faces the real possibility of criminal charges. Then, when he is truly scared, we can negotiate from a position of absolute strength. Communications also started coming from Patricia. Calls from friends of mine who knew Matthew socially. Messages from people who cared about keeping family peace. All urging me to make peace. All suggesting the details weren't as important as reconciliation. But I knew better. I knew the reconciliation they were suggesting was simply allowing Matthew to continue his manipulations, allowing him to live without consequences, allowing him to believe he could betray his family and get away with it. The night before the christening of Matthew's youngest child, Martha called me. Arthur, I need you to know that Matthew has rejected every settlement offer. His lawyers are preparing a vigorous defense. They are going to argue that all transactions were authorized by Rose, that the documents were prepared with the consent of a professional, that there is no fraud, that instead you are the one committing fraud by trying to keep assets that rightfully belong to your son. Do you think they'll win? No, Martha replied without hesitation. Not with the evidence we have. But they are going to make it ugly. They are going to try to destroy your character. They are going to try to make you look like a vengeful father trying to punish a son for personal reasons. It's going to be an ugly battle. When does the trial start? The first hearing is scheduled for September. We have 4 months to prepare our case completely. 4 months for Matthew to sit with the reality of what he has done. I hung up, thinking about those 4 months, about the christening that was about to happen, about the way Matthew would try to act as if nothing had changed, as if our lives weren't about to be transformed by what was about to happen. But I knew something fundamental had changed. I had gone from being a victim of my son's betrayal to being an active agent of justice. I had gathered evidence. I had contacted lawyers. I had documented every transgression. I was ready. The christening of Matthew's son was scheduled for June 5th, a sunny Saturday, a celebration of new life, a family occasion. But I knew something more important was going to happen that day, something that would change everything, something I had already been planning in secret for weeks. The night before the christening, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the bed I had shared with Rose for 28 years, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. My mind was in constant turmoil. I mentally reviewed every detail of what was about to happen, every word I planned to say, every possible reaction Matthew might have. At 3 a.m. I got up and walked to the living room. The silence of the house was deafening. Without Rose, without the sound of her breathing in the next room, the house felt like a mausoleum, like a monument to everything I had lost. Not just my wife, but also the illusion I had about who my son was. I sat in front of the window, looking out at the dark street. The streetlights cast yellow light on the pavement, damp with morning dew. I thought about the day Matthew was born, about how Rose had placed him in my arms, her eyes full of hope and love, about how I had silently promised to protect him, educate him, love him unconditionally. At what point had everything gone so wrong? When did the child I loved start to become the man who was now willing to deceive me, steal from me, forge documents? Was it my fault? Had I failed somehow as a father? Those questions tormented me, but at the same time I knew I had no answers. Guilt was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. What I needed was clarity and determination. At 6 in the morning, I called Martha. I knew she was probably sleeping, but I needed to talk to someone. I needed confirmation that I was doing the right thing. "Arthur?" she answered. After several rings, her voice still sleepy. "Are you okay?" "I can't sleep," I admitted. "I'm having doubts. Doubting if I should do this. Doubting if exposing everything publicly is really what I want." "What is it you really want?" Martha asked, and I could hear her sitting up, waking up completely. The question was harder to answer than I expected. I want him to understand what he did. I want him to face consequences. But I also want him to be my son. I want this to have never happened. "Arthur, listen to me," Martha said, her voice taking on a more professional yet compassionate tone. What Matthew didn't happen by accident. It wasn't a youthful mistake. It was deliberate. It was planned. And when you confronted his actions, instead of repenting, he escalated. He tried to sell your properties, forged documents, threatened your reputation. This doesn't stop on its own, Arthur. People like that don't change because they feel bad. They change when they face real consequences. And what if I destroy him in the process? What if my lawsuit ruins him financially? Then he will have learned a very expensive lesson, Martha replied bluntly. Sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes it's the only language people like that understand. I hung up feeling a little better, though not completely. I spent the next day in a kind of trance. I took a bath. I shaved carefully. I chose clothes that were elegant, but not too formal. A navy blue blazer, cream-colored pants, black leather shoes. I wanted to look like what I was, a dignified man. A man who had lived a full life and had nothing to be ashamed of. At 3 in the afternoon, I received a call from Teresa, my sister-in-law. "Arthur, I know what you're planning to do at the christening," she began without preamble. Martha told me. "I wanted you to know that Rose would have wanted you to do this. She hated seeing her son become what he has become, but she didn't know how to stop him. So I hope you, in her memory, will do what she couldn't." Teresa's words touched me deeply. She gave me the permission I didn't know I needed. Permission from someone who had loved Rose. Permission from someone who had also seen the betrayal. "Will you be there?" I asked. "Of course," she replied. "I'll be sitting near the front, and when the time comes, when you take the microphone, I'll be watching Matthew's face, and I'll be internally celebrating every second of discomfort he feels." When I hung up, I realized my hands were shaking. But it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation, from a feeling that, finally, after all these weeks, the pieces were about to fall into place. I spent the hours before the christening mentally reviewing what I was about to say. I had no papers this time, not like at Rose's funeral. I had memorized every word, every sentence, every transition. I wanted it to be spontaneous, to seem like I was revealing the truth in real time, not reading from a prepared script. At 6 in the evening, I headed to the event hall where the christening reception was being held. It was an elegant place, overlooking the river. The room was decorated in pastel tones, round tables with white tablecloths, fresh flowers at every center. About 70 people were already there. Friends of Matthew, friends of Patricia, extended family. Some of the same faces that had been at Rose's funeral. Matthew was standing near the entrance, radiant in a new suit that surely cost more than $1,000. Patricia was by his side, holding the baby being christened. Their younger children played near the tables. Everything looked perfect, normal, as if nothing strange was happening. When Matthew saw me, his expression changed briefly. A flash of anxiety crossed his face. Then he smiled again, but it was a forced smile. He knew I would be here. He knew something was about to happen. I sat at a table with Teresa and some of Rose's friends I had invited. They hugged me. They whispered words of support. "We're with you," one said. "We know what he did," said another. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone in this. During the formal christening ceremony, which took place in a small chapel inside the hall, I stood near the baptismal font. I watched the priest pour water over the baby's head. I listened as Matthew pledged his commitment to raise the child in the faith. The words sounded hollow, empty, as if coming from a man without a soul. After the ceremony, during the reception, the speeches began. James Sinclair spoke first, of course. He talked about the importance of family, about values, about continuity. His words made me feel sick. Then Patricia made a brief comment, thanking everyone for attending. Then several friends got up to make toasts. The atmosphere was relaxed, celebratory. No one suspected what was about to happen. When the master of ceremonies asked if anyone else wanted to make a speech, I stood up slowly. The room fell silent. Everyone was looking at me. Matthew specifically tensed up. I could see him talking quickly to James. They both got up from their seats. I walked to the microphone at the podium. My heart was pounding, but my voice was firm. "Good evening, everyone," I began. "My name is Arthur Miller. I am the grandfather of this beautiful baby who was christened today, and I am here to talk about family." Matthew started walking toward the front of the room. His face was red. James was behind him, whispering something to him. But I continued. Family is important. It's the most important thing. But family also requires honesty. It requires integrity. It requires us to love each other enough to be honest even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. "Matthew, wait," he ordered, looking directly at him. His jaw was tight. His fists were clenched. "What I am about to reveal, I do not do for revenge. I do it because I believe the truth is important, and because I believe that Rose, Matthew's mother, deserves to have the truth spoken in her name." It was then that Matthew reached the podium. He tried to snatch the microphone from me, exactly as he had at the funeral, but this time I was prepared. I stepped aside, keeping the microphone out of his reach. "Security!" James yelled from the back of the room. But it was too late. Everyone was watching now, and I had started to speak. "At my wife's funeral, my son forbade me to speak," I began, holding the microphone away as Matthew tried to grab it again. A security guard from the hall finally intervened, placing himself between us. He ordered me to be quiet, to sit down. He humiliated me in front of 80 people. That day, I didn't understand why. Today, you are all going to understand why. Matthew was red with fury. He was shouting things that couldn't be heard over the murmur of the crowd. Patricia had stood up, frightened. Her children were confused, not understanding what was happening. Teresa was standing too, watching every moment with an expression of calm support. After the funeral, I continued, my voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around me. I began to investigate. I found letters my son wrote to his mother, letters where he clearly explained his plan, his intention to separate from me, to manipulate her, to gain access to our finances. The faces in the room had changed. The celebratory atmosphere had evaporated. Now there was confusion, unease. Some of the guests were starting to whisper among themselves. "My son," I said slowly, pronouncing each word carefully, "stole $16,000 from the bank account I shared with my wife. He did it using a password he obtained fraudulently. He did it during the months when his mother was dealing with a terminal illness. James Sinclair was yelling now, calling for the venue staff. Matthew was still trying to get to me, but the guard held him back. The christened baby was crying. Patricia rocked him desperately, her eyes darting between me and her husband in horror. When I confronted my son about these transfers, I pressed on. Instead of admitting it and apologizing, he tried to sell one of our properties, a property that didn't belong to him. He used forged documents, documents that were prepared with the assistance of his father-in-law, James Sinclair, who is a lawyer and should know better. Now there was complete chaos. Some guests were getting up, others were recording with their cell phones. The news of this would spread. I knew it. Social media would spread this. The humiliation would be public and permanent. Also, I continued, raising my voice to be heard over the noise, when I took legal action to protect myself and my assets, my son threatened me. He threatened to expose his mother as a woman with dementia, to destroy her memory, to use her as a weapon against me if I didn't drop my lawsuits. Matthew finally managed to break the security guard's grip. He lunged for the podium, but instead of reaching me, he tripped, fell to the floor in front of everyone. He scrambled up quickly, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. Now he was the one being humiliated, in front of 70 people, in front of his friends, in front of his extended family. It was a perfect mirror of what he had done to me at the funeral. What I am about to say now is the most important part, I said, waiting for the chaos to die down a bit. Because I am not here simply to air dirty laundry. I am here because I believe in consequences. I believe in accountability. I believe people must be responsible for their actions. The room was quieter now. Even Matthew had paused, breathing heavily, waiting to see what would come next. Therefore, here and now, in front of all these witnesses, I formally declared, I am announcing that I have modified my will. My estate, my properties, my savings, everything that should have gone to my son, Matthew Miller, will now go to my sister-in-law, Teresa. I could see Matthew's face change. First, it went blank, then it exploded again. What? He screamed. You can't do that. I'm disinherited. Exactly, I confirmed. You are disinherited. Not because you are my son, and it's easy. You are disinherited because you have violated the most sacred contract that exists, the contract between a father and a son. Because you have chosen greed over loyalty. Because you have chosen deceit over honesty. This is a lie, Matthew yelled, turning now to the audience. I am being unjustly accused. My father is lying. He's taking revenge on me. The proof is in my lawyer's hands, I replied calmly. Complete documentation, bank transfers, forged documents, recorded threats, letters in your own handwriting. It will all be presented in court in September. But in the meantime, I wanted the truth to be known here, to be heard publicly, because you deserve to be known for who you really are. Teresa had approached the podium. I put my arm around her. Her eyes were full of tears, but it was an expression of support, of justice finally achieved. My sister-in-law, I continued, addressing the crowd, has been a woman of exceptional character. She has stood by me during this crisis. She helped her sister Rose when she faced our son's abuse. She has been my emotional support when I've been lost. She deserves to inherit what our son has rejected through his actions. But I also stipulate this, I added, looking directly at Matthew. Teresa will use that inheritance to ensure my grandchildren receive an education, that they are raised properly, that they do not suffer for their father's actions. But you, Matthew, will not receive $1. You will receive nothing. For the rest of your life, you will live knowing that your greed cost you your inheritance, that your dishonesty cost you your relationship with your father, that your malice will isolate you from your own family. Now, I continued, there is one more thing I need everyone to understand. This is not an act of revenge. It is an act of justice. It is a declaration that in this family, integrity matters, honesty matters, and respect for others matters. I stepped down from the podium. I handed the microphone to the master of ceremonies. The people in the room were completely silent. Some were recording, others were whispering, some were just looking at Matthew with new eyes. Eyes that saw who he really was. I walked over to Teresa. Together, we headed for the door. As I walked, I passed close to Patricia. She was holding the baby, her eyes red from crying. I'm sorry, I said softly. But your husband made his own choices, and now he must live with the consequences. Dad, wait, Matthew yelled behind me. Please, we can talk, we can fix this. I didn't turn around, I didn't answer, I just walked out of the room. In the car, as Teresa drove away from the venue, I allowed the emotions to finally surface. I cried. I cried for Rose. I cried for the relationship I had lost with my son. I cried for the time I had invested in a man who turned out to be fundamentally corrupt. But I also cried with relief, because finally, after months of anguish, after months of uncertainty, I had spoken the truth, publicly, completely, irrevocably. "How do you feel?" Teresa asked, her eyes on the road. "I'm at peace," I answered. And I found that it was true. I am finally at peace. 3 months after the christening, the first court hearing took place in an austere room at the Chicago courthouse. Martha presented our case with precision and clarity. The documents were displayed, the recordings were played, the witnesses testified. Henry described what he had heard at the barbershop. Teresa confirmed the conversations Rose had shared with her. Richard, the real estate agent, presented the forged documents Matthew had tried to use. Matthew sat in the room, accompanied by his lawyers from Sinclair and Associates. His expression was different now. The arrogance was gone. The confidence of someone who believed he could get away with it was gone. Now there was only panic, calculation, desperation. The judge, a 62-year-old woman named Isabel Sanchez, listened to everything without interruption. She took notes, looked at the documents. Occasionally she would look at Matthew with an expression that suggested disgust. When she finally closed the case for deliberation, she said something that resonated deeply with me. "I have heard many cases of family disputes in my 30 years on the bench," she declared. "But rarely have I seen such a systematic and premeditated level of fraud directed against one's own parents. This is a particularly disturbing case, where greed, manipulation, and deceit were used not only to obtain money, but also to emotionally and socially harm the victim." The sentence came 2 weeks later. Matthew was ordered to pay back $32,000, not just the $16,000 he had stolen, but also interest and legal costs. Furthermore, he was found liable for document fraud. The case was referred to the criminal authorities for further investigation. But what was most significant was that Rose's will was fully validated. Her provisions would remain intact. I would remain the heir to her estate, and the change I had made to my own will, leaving everything to Teresa instead of Matthew, was declared valid and binding. Matthew appealed the sentence, of course. His lawyers argued he was unjustly convicted, that he was being punished for complicated family dynamics, that the evidence was circumstantial. But the appeal was rejected. The Court of Appeals upheld the original sentence. Matthew would have to pay. He would have to face the consequences. After the final judgment, I received a letter from Patricia. It was brief, but impactful. "Arthur, I don't know if you can ever forgive me for what happened. I didn't know the truth about what Matthew was doing. If I had known, I would have tried to stop him. He changed after he started working with James. He became different, more greedy, more manipulative. I have made the decision to separate from him. I cannot be with a man who betrays his own family this way. Our children ask about you. I would like for you to see them occasionally, but I would understand if you didn't want to. I visited my grandchildren once a month after that. They were good kids, innocent of their father's crimes. They didn't deserve to suffer for his actions. Patricia was kind to me. She never blamed me, and I never blamed her. She was a victim too, in a way, a victim of the man her husband had become. In September 2019, exactly 6 months after Rose's funeral, I made a decision. I decided to sell my house in Chicago. I decided to leave behind the city where I had spent the last 30 years. I decided to start over. With Teresa and her family, I bought a small house on the coast. It was a white stone house overlooking the ocean. It had a small garden where I could grow tomatoes and herbs. It had a balcony where I could spend my afternoons reading. It was perfect. During the first month in my new home, I spent most of my time just existing, walking along the beaches, watching the sun sink into the horizon each night, eating slowly, sleeping deeply. It was as if my body was finally discovering it was safe, that it could rest. Teresa lived 3 houses away. She often came over to bring me food she had prepared. We would sit on my balcony, looking at the ocean, talking about Rose, about the good times, about the moments we had shared as a family. We never mentioned Matthew. It wasn't necessary. A year later, I received some news. Matthew had moved to Boston. His businesses had collapsed after the truth about his frauds became public. Several of his client accounts had been frozen. His business partners had abandoned him. No one wanted to work with a man who had been convicted of fraud. Patricia and the children had also moved to a different city. Patricia finally divorced Matthew. She got shared custody of the children. She worked as an administrative assistant in an insurance office. It was a humble life, but it was honest. It was dignified. I continued to visit my grandchildren. Sometimes, I took them to the beach. We read stories together. I helped them with their homework. They gradually began to understand me, to see that I wasn't the villain their father might have taught them to believe I was. They were good kids, smart, compassionate. They had the potential to become better people than their father. 2 years after moving to the coast, I received a visit one day. A 6-year-old man. It was my godson. I hadn't seen him in 15 years. He told me he had read about my case, that he had seen clips of what happened at the christening online, that he had wanted to talk to me. We spent the afternoon together on my balcony. He was a thoughtful man who spent a lot of time thinking about his own family and his own responsibilities. At the end of the afternoon, he asked me something that made me reflect deeply. "Have you ever considered forgiving Matthew?" he asked. I thought about it for a long time. "Forgiving doesn't mean being in contact with him," I finally replied. "Forgiving means allowing my wounds to heal. It means not allowing his malice to continue to define me. And I have done that. I have healed. I have moved on. But forgiving doesn't mean I have to let him back into my life. Some damage cannot be repaired. Some crimes have permanent consequences." He nodded as if this was the answer he expected to hear. Now, as I write this, I am 65 years old. I am fully retired. I spend my days reading, walking, tending my garden. I sleep without nightmares. I eat without heartburn. I have regained the peace that Matthew had stolen from me. Sometimes, in the mornings when I wake up and hear the sound of the ocean, I think of Rose. I think of what she was to me. The sacrifice she made. How she, even in her final days, tried to protect me by saving those letters. I talk to the wind. I tell her about my days. I tell her I have found peace, that I am okay. And in those moments I swear I can hear her voice, carried on the ocean breeze, telling me she's proud of me, that I did the right thing, that there is no dishonor in defending your dignity, in demanding justice, in protecting your life from those who seek to exploit it. Matthew still lives in Boston. From what I've heard, he has tried to rebuild his life, but the reputation he built was destroyed. No one wants to work with him. His friends abandoned him. Even his own parents cut him off after learning the truth of his actions. He lives a life of self-imposed isolation, not because I chose it for him, but because he chose his own actions. This is the lesson I wanted him to learn, not to be rich or successful, but that actions have consequences, that integrity matters, that family is sacred and should not be betrayed for greed. I will never be the grandfather I should have been to his children. We will never travel together. I will never share college graduations. I will never be the stable presence in their lives that I could have been, and that is the greatest loss of all. It is not my loss. It is his. He sacrificed his own family for money he never even needed, and now he must live with that. As I sit here on my balcony watching the sun set over the ocean, I know I have gained something more valuable than money. I have gained my dignity. I have gained my peace of mind. I have gained the satisfaction of knowing I faced injustice and overcame it. This is my story, a story of betrayal, but also a story of resilience, of justice, of a man who stood up after being humiliated and declared that his life mattered, that his dignity could not be stolen, that he deserved to be respected. And although the path was painful, although the cost was high, I know I did the right thing. I know Rose would have been proud, and that knowledge is enough. If you liked this story, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thanks for watching.